Hey everyone, welcome back. In today's video, we're going to explore particle systems in Unity, an essential tool for adding dynamic visual effects to your game. Whether you're creating fire, smoke, rain, or magical effects, Unity's particle system allows us to simulate these effects in real time. We'll go over how to set up particle systems and to tweak its properties, and to customize it to fit the game style. By the end of the video, you'll have a solid understanding of how to create particle effects that will bring your scene to life. So let's go ahead and jump in. We're going to keep this relatively basic, but let's introduce particles so you're aware of what they are and you can take a deeper dive into them if they appeal to you. So let's start by creating a new scene here. We'll probably add them into our environment, but we'll just do a new scene now. Do a basic built-in, and I'm going to come in here with my directional light, and I'm just going to lower this rotation. Make sure you have gizmos turned on for this today, but we're going to make it a bit dim like this. So where do particles live? If you come up here to game objects and you come under effects, you're going to see that we have a few different particles that we can play around with. Now I'm just going to introduce us to the basic particle system so we understand how they work and you can play around with them. But let's get started. So just go ahead and click that, and just like that, congratulations, you've created particles. So what are particles? For those of you who may be newer to 3D or games, particles are these little sprites that float into 3D space and have a graphic assigned to them. Now, this isn't how this actually looks. If I come in here and I adjust my game camera to be looking at these particles, you'll see that they don't have the square around them. They just look like these floating balls. And these balls are what we call a billboard. That's where a polygon plane is being adjusted and rotated towards the camera, and it gives them the appearance of being spheres. Now, you can do all sorts of things with particles. You can even project geometry into scenes if you want. Just taking a look at some of the basic navigation, we have this pause, restart, stop menu here. This allows us to play the particle effect to preview how it's going to look. You can see we can adjust things like the play speed to speed through it. We generally keep this at 1 because that's going to be the real-time speed. And we can use this to preview. Now, this does not actually impact anything. I want to emphasize that. What impacts the particles is what we see over here in the inspector. This is the particle system in the inspector. Now, like I mentioned, we're just going to scratch the surface of this, but all of these things allow us to do different things with the particle system. There's a lot. It's a very robust system. And the reason why is these particles are going to allow us to create everything from little dust motes to snow to rain to fire to smoke to laser beams to wind effects. You can do a whole lot with these once you dive in and start playing with them. Like I mentioned, our main goal here is to just get some exposure, let everyone know that these are in here. So if you wanted to take a deeper dive, you could go look into this. Now, this falls into the category of VFX, or what we call visual effects. So this is what a VFX artist might be doing in a game situation. This also is often the role of an artist called a technical animator. And technical animators are animators that deal with Unity stuff quite often. They don't just deal with keyframing inside of an application like Maya. They deal with setting up the animations in Game Engine, and a lot of the times that includes building and setting up visual effects to work with scripting. Most particle systems need to be tied to a script in some way. So if you think of a magic effect, for example, you have to cast a spell. What we're going to look at is maybe an environmental situation like adding little dust motes to our scene. Now, going through these, we can play around with some of the settings in here, and we can use this to visualize them if we have play going. If we increase duration, you're going to notice it doesn't really do anything right now. So we're not going to worry about that. Because this loops, that's the main reason. If we set this to not loop, you would see duration all of a sudden becomes more relevant, because it's going to be how long those things last before they disappear. So if I set the duration to 1, we'd see it quicker, but in this case, 5 worked fine. You'll see they disappear. So if you have looping, we don't really need to worry about duration. Pre-warm's kind of interesting. You'll notice when I hit play, it starts from a point. If you have pre-warm turned on and I stop and restart this, you'll see it doesn't start from a point, it just comes from everywhere. And when you're doing an environmental effect, you usually want to have this set up because pre-warm just makes it so it's already in place, it's already going. Whereas for a visual effect like a spell or an ability, we wouldn't want to have that turned on because you'd want to show it coming from the source. Start lifetime and start speed. Speed makes sense. It's how fast things move. Notice, though, it also controls distance. So it's not only how fast they move, it's how far they get. And then lifetime is how long they last before they die. So right now they're lasting 5, which is the same as the duration. If I set this to 1, you'd see they never got that high because they're going to disappear when 1 rolls around. Now, why are these significant? You might be wondering. Notice this little drop down here. This is one of those small details you might miss in these systems. You can actually add variation to these by using these drop downs here. So if I click this drop down, you'll see I can have it set to constant, which makes it a constant rate. Not that useful. I could do a curve, which makes it curve over time. I could do a random between 2 constants and a random between 2 curves. So just to show curves actually allow me to take a curve down here and edit this. So I could kind of ramp that and make it more gradual over time. Not terribly useful for what I'm trying to do here. Between 2 constants, though, we could have one, let's say, go between 1 and another go between 10. And now what we'll get is we'll get variation and when these things die off. So now the shape's not going to be as uniform. And you could do the same thing with curves. To keep things simple, I'll just use the lifetime here and maybe go between 1 and 5. You can do the same thing with speed. So we could do random between 2 curves or random between 2 constants. In this case, maybe I'll try 2 curves. We could just give this curve a sine wave that way, and then maybe play around with the other one. I actually don't really like that because they're falling through, so I think I'll just stick with 2 constants. So in terms of this, we could have a start speed of maybe 5 and a start speed of 10 if we wanted to have some variations in terms of distance traveled. You can see the same thing happens with size. If we increase size here, you'll see that making these large creates almost a smoke-like effect. Making them small creates these sort of fairy particles. We could also do a random range here. So I could do between 1 and 5, for example, to have variation in these sizes. And then as we move our way down, you can see a lot of these work the same way. Now, something that can be kind of neat is the color here. You can see there's this start color. This is actually going to be what colors these. So if we wanted to make these smoke or something, you can see we could switch to grays or blacks. And by instance, I might just play around with the color here, and you can see here we could do a random between 2 gradients or random color in general, which is kind of interesting. So between 2 gradients would probably be more interesting, or even just between 1 gradient. I think we could just switch this to a gradient now that I think about it. What that will do is it'll make it so at the start it's one color, and then as it transitions to another point, it changes. So you'll see at the start it goes white, and then as it goes towards its death, it'll go yellow and then white again. I think I'll just give a slight coloration to this. Maybe make it kind of pollen colored, and we can even play with the whites if we wanted to. We also have this alpha channel. So what's kind of neat with this alpha channel here is if we grab this and crank it down, we can adjust the opacity of these as they transition. It looks like I need to add another one here. You can do that by clicking on the top, and I can make it so they go fully opaque, and as they fade out, they disappear. So where they begin and where they end, they kind of fade into existence and gain color, which will create some variation. You can play around with the gravity modifier. Right now it's 0. If I increase this, you'll see it will make it fall. So we can take our particle and change it from an upwards floating magical effect to rain or water or maybe sparks falling down. I'll leave it at 0 for now. For the simulation space, you can see there's local and world. If we switch this to something like world and I move this, you'll see that it will track with the controller. So world actually keeps track of position, and this can be great for like smoke effects on like a train or some sort of a vehicle or even trailing off of a character or an item. Whereas switching it to local will make it constant, so these will always be spewing. If you're going to have this in motion, this isn't as practical, but it really depends on what kind of effect you're trying to produce. I'll leave it on local for now, but we could set that up. And there's also a custom option. I'm not familiar with that, but it's in there. Simulation speed is going to be how fast it simulates. So you can see I can increase or decrease that. And that's going to be a modifier on top of these ones. So it's kind of easier to control. If I wanted something more wispy-like, you could see I could set it down to like 0.1, and we could make these hardly move. We could play around with scale. You can see there's local, hierarchical, and shape. I'm going to leave that be, though. Play on awake means when the level activates, we can have that turned on and off, and we can script that into code. And I think those are the main things we're going to need to look at here in this first section. Now, once we get down into here, we have all sorts. So for example, emission, this is going to be the rate over time. This is how many it spits out over time. If I increase this, you'll see it gets more and more, and we get more density. You can also see rate over distance. We can make it increase rate as it goes over distance. I'm going to leave that be at 10, but that will be fine. The shape is going to be the shape of our emitter, and right now it's a cone. We could switch this to something like a hemisphere if we wanted these to spread out. We could do a sphere if you wanted them to go in all directions. And you get the idea. There's all sorts here in terms of things you can play with. You can even base it on a mesh that you could input into here. So we could input a mesh, for example. We could have our little doggy dog here kind of emitting these. And you'll notice the dog's not there when we click off of it. It just has it here as a mesh. Most meshes are going to work like a sphere, so just something to be aware of. In the case of what I'm going for just kind of wisps I could add to my forest, I'd probably go with something like a hemisphere here. Now, with that said, we could also play around with all of this stuff. So velocity over lifetime might be useful. Color by speed could be interesting. I don't think too many of these are that interesting. We could add a noise. This could be kind of interesting. You can use different noise profiles here, which will add jitter to these. So rather than them just floating up, they'll actually move along these noises here. We could even do separate axes here and do individual axes to edit it. I'm going to leave it be so we can see this a little bit better, but if I go ahead and increase the strength here, and I go ahead and increase the speed, you can see how the strength here almost makes them look like little bees going off. And that can actually be pretty useful for creating insect-type motion. So you can see with a high speed and these particles, we could simulate this. Now, this is currently at 1, so I don't want the strength to be that high, but it would be nice to have some sort of subtle movement to these as they're going, so it kind of looks like they are wandering and don't have a set direction. The frequency is going to be how often the noise occurs, so a higher frequency is going to create more jittering, a lower frequency is going to create larger movement shapes. So I'll keep it low for now. You could also introduce a scroll speed, which will animate the noise. That can add even more interesting movement to your particle system. So really cool stuff you can do with that. So looking at that, I think that's pretty good for just kind of like a fairy type texture here. The only thing I might adjust now is playing around with things like the duration and maybe the lifespan of these. So what would happen if we set this to 10 and, you know, allowed them to have a longer lifespan, or maybe played around with something like speed. But I think this looks okay. You know, nothing wrong with this. This will add some magical fairy dust to our scene as our character's running. So I can go ahead and just add this to my prefabs. I could create a new folder here. We could just call this particles. And I could just take this particle system. We could go ahead and just name this our pollen, or whatever we want to call this, and bring it down here into our assets and into our particles. Now, if I go ahead and open up my scene that I want to put these in, we'll go ahead and open up our sandbox 2. We can introduce our magical pollen to the scene by just dragging it into a location and seeing how it looks. Now, as with everything, we might have to adjust things like scale. You can see the scale on this is pretty horrendous. I could double click into here and we could change the size. So if we take a look at the start size, it's 1 and 2. We could play around with like 0.1 and 2, or we could also play around with scale, now that I think about it. If we scale these down, in theory, let me look for my particles. So if we scale this down, in theory, we can probably make this smaller for the scene and make those particles smaller. So kind of depends on the scene size. We could also play around with the spread for these if we wanted to, but I could go through and I could add in, you know, a couple of these little pollen effects around these areas. And if I wanted to take more time, I could customize it to maybe have a better feel for the scene and be more appropriate for the scale. But for now, we'll just add those in, and let's hit play and see if we can spot them. This is a really large level, so might take a different approach here. But you can see how we now have those little magic dust nodes floating, and it kind of adds a little bit of something to the scene here. that we can visually grab onto as we're running through some of these open spaces. So I can look for where it would be appropriate to add those things. That one looks like it may be on the ground, but we can see it's a relatively successful result here. It does give it a pretty magical feel. Now, before I wrap things up, though, I do want to talk about the ability to kind of change the look of these. I didn't quite get to that. If you come down here to Renderer, this is going to be where we can change the visual look, and you'll see that you have different options. This is simply called a billboard. That's going to be what's rotating. And you can see there's a material here that we have, which is the default material, but I could actually put on any of these various materials. Now, it works best with things that have an alpha, so that's something to be aware of. So most of these probably aren't going to work unless we find the particular ones that are for visual effects. For example, like the shockwave, you can see how that's being placed on there, or these respawn particles. Those are good examples of alphas that'll work, or even this grenadier. You can see we can make these interesting little sonic bubbles. Now, I might want to just get this back to the default, which might be easiest done by hitting Control-Z. But we can see if we can find it here and find the default particle. You can also change it to be other things. You can see there's stretch billboards, horizontal billboards, vertical billboards. Those are all variants of the billboards. The more interesting thing here, though, is mesh. And you'll see it's a cube by default that we can map to. And as a matter of fact, with this being a cube, we might even be able to choose one of our cube maps to map to it. But this is what I mean by you can make virtually anything into a particle. So you can see if I use a cube here, we could use that. I could even come in here and use one of the plants. Or if I wanted to do something really abstract, I could even do something like the grenadier or one of the character meshes. Looks like those aren't loading in this instance. There it goes. I'd have to find the source geometry for this, and I don't think I'm finding those files. But you can see we could load these in as meshes as well. I'm going to keep my billboards and go back to my default particle material. But that will give us our own custom particle effect inside of here. So I'm not going to dive too deep into this. And just, in terms of particles, I want to scratch the surface so you're aware they're in here. And you could create your basic particles, just kind of playing around with these effects. We could also explore the particle systems that come with the kit. So that's something that's also useful if you want to reverse engineer them, for example. If we come into the assets folder and we go into 3D Game Kit and you go into prefabs, there should be one in here for VFX. And inside here, you'll see things like the environment where you can find different particles. You'll actually see there's some bird VFX. So we can have these things flying up in the sky. You can see they're like little lizard birds. They have butterflies. So you could have a butterfly flying around. They actually have their own dust motes. So we could take a look at how they approach their dust motes. Probably better than our quick pass. They have some actual dust particles, fireflies that you could add into your scene, more fireflies here, there we go. They have a fog bank we could utilize, maybe put on the water. So that's going to be environment prefabs. We have other things in here as well. You can see there's the interactable prefabs, so the open door, wall impacts. There's character ones we're already aware of because they're attached to Ellen. They have some weapon ones here, like when you hit something. So if we wanted to, we could add in some of these to our scene. So let me go ahead and open our scene and go into our sandbox 2. We could come into the VFX in here, into our environment, and we could add in maybe a big old butterfly flying around this area. That might be kind of neat. Just have it flying near here. And we could come in and adjust its settings as well if we wanted to. We could play around with the dust particles they have. Right, we want dust motes. We don't want dust particles. Theirs are kind of more blinky, I feel like. I'm kind of curious if we could use these differently, playing around with these. I don't know exactly how many of these we get, but I could play around with doing something like this. I'm not sure their scale relative to the world and the character, though. But if they don't appear huge, this might be a very convenient way to just add them to the entirety of the level. And we could add more specific ones, too, like fireflies. Maybe we have fireflies in some of these bushes, where you're going to see the shading and the heavy forest areas. And then, of course, fog, if we wanted to experiment with, we could maybe bring the fog onto the water here and play around with having fog on top of the water. We might need more than one particle effect for that, but I could play around with that, maybe sink it in here a little bit, and maybe even scale it a bit or add a secondary one. And this is an instance where if we do know these things, we can make some changes. So for example, this one has a start color set to be kind of this green. We could alter this to be more of a white or even a white blue if we wanted to make it appropriate for this scene. And if I go ahead and duplicate this one, I could just add more over here, but we could play around with that. So now that we have these in place, let's just see how this impacts things. The particle effects they have, and notice we now know how to modify them. So if you wanted to alter these to be your own, hopefully you're comfortable getting in there and kind of changing some of those dials. So there's a big butterfly. Let's see if we can spot some fireflies in here. I think I put them over here. There's some fireflies there. Those are pretty cool. And you can see they actually have like full-on animated fireflies there. It'd be neat to see the files they used for those. Also remember I scaled those dust motes to be huge. You can see they're floating around in the sky there a little bit. So there's not really too many at eye level so far, which is interesting. And then I think somewhere over this way was the water where we can look at the fog effect just to see. I haven't done anything to the water, so it still doesn't have a collider or anything. But we can see the fog there, so that's kind of an accidental fog. I'd have to control that. I'm pretty sure that was, or it was just a weird specular hit. Let's see if I can find this ocean of mine, or lake. So you can see we've added the fog effect on top of there. And it's kind of hard to see. I might have to put it up higher if I want it to really have a huge impact. But you can see how it does have a neat little impact there on the water. And like I mentioned, I need to make it so I can't go into the water. But pretty cool overall. All right. So that'll give us some particle effects in the scene and kind of bring it to life a bit more. So that's going to wrap up our introduction to the particle systems in Unity with the 3D Game Kit. We've covered how to create basic particle systems, how to customize its property, and even explored some advanced settings to give you extra control over the effects. So experiment with different configurations to see how particles can enhance your game's atmosphere, dive into the 3D Game Kit's particles, play around with those, modify them, see what you can make out of them. If you found this video helpful, don't forget to like, subscribe, and drop a comment to let me know what particle effects you're planning to create. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.